So welcome to indyliveradio, and we have got two great guests here for you today. This is a very important day, the 22nd of January 2021, and it's important for reasons connected with CND, and that's why we've got two guests from Glasgow CND on today, and we're delighted to welcome Johnnie Hunter. Hello, Johnnie.
Hi there, how's it going?
Very well, thanks. And the Iona Soper. Hello, Iona.
Hiya.
Are you two guys are okay today?
Yeah, getting on well. Just working away despite the lockdown.
I know it's a bit of a sair chav, as we say where I come from. But we have to keep going. So, and I'm Valerie Gold, and I'm here with my co-host Marlene Halliday.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone.
I'd like to start maybe by asking yourselves, Johnnie and Iona, about your own involvement in the CND, you know, how long you've been involved with Glasgow CND and what inspired you to get involved. Could we start with you, Iona, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been sort of knocking about the Scottish peace movement for the last kind of 4 or 5 years. I initially kind of kicked things off in more of an academic capacity. It was part of my degree. I decided to go off and study the Faslane Peace Camp out on the West Coast, and kind of started researching all of these issues because of that. And then obviously went off, spent the summer there, and realised that I was much better at doing that than I was at being a student. So went off, quickly graduated, got my degree, and then moved back. So I was very involved with the peace camp, and I remain very involved with the peace camp, even though I don't live there anymore. I took a wee stint in the Scottish CND office, did some work with Peace Education Scotland. I'm currently working with a kind of new organisation called Secure Scotland that's again looking at some of these kind of issues around rethinking security and defence and what it all means. And I think ultimately there was a very clear turning point for me when I sort of realised that I wasn't about to let this go, which was when the Trident renewal vote happened in Westminster in 2016. I was up at Faslane giving an interview to the BBC, and they got me up, and I think I was just meant to be giving a wee quick interview for a quick segment on the news, but they sort of went, "Oh, while you're here, you know, let's get you to have a sort of live debate with a local councillor." All about Faslane and the sort of pros and cons of it being there. And the entire interview, all of the kind of things, all of the kind of issues that were being raised, it was none of the humanitarian causes, it was none of the expense causes, it was nothing to do with the kind of reality of what nuclear weapons are. It was all kind of this notion of, you know, how's Helensburgh going to survive? How are we going to keep the local Tesco open if the base goes? And you're realising that actually not only are the people that are advocating for the nuclear weapons in Scotland completely unaware of the actual campaign against them. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, not one agency is advocating for the removal of Faslane. And you're realising that all of these arguments are just being put out to kind of patronise the masses and kind of keep everyone quiet and keep everyone thinking about things on a really local issue rather than kind of facing up to the reality of what these are. I mean, they're weapons of mass destruction, you know, Absolutely. And they're right on our doorstep. So I think that was definitely the point for me where I was like a dog with a bone and I was not about to let it go, and I still haven't. So here we are.
Sounds like you're already a great spokesperson for CND and for disarmament. How about yourself, Johnnie? What is your route into being interested in this area?
I'm not sure it's as exciting or enthralling as Iona's. That was a tough act to follow. I mean, I came to CND my own way, probably quite a typical way for a lot of folk. I think I've been a member probably since I was turned 16 and first started getting involved in politics, left-wing politics in the trade union movement. So as I said, I joined when I was 16. I think even from quite a young age, it was apparent to me that, war in general is, anathema to what we think about as, good human nature, what it defines to be human, not harming your fellow man, regardless of their country. And nuclear weapons, as Iona touched on, is the insanity of war taken to its logical conclusion. Weapons with so-called mutually assured destruction that, you know, the only loser in that zero-sum game is the human race. So, you know, I think for most right-minded people, and I think the vast majority of people in Scotland and internationally, nuclear weapons are, you know, offensive in general terms. I think as well at that time, though, when I was first sort of getting involved with politics, you know, that was really the coming on of the age of austerity. So, you know, you had the condemned government getting in Westminster. So at the same time as, you know, food was being taken out the mouths of children living in poverty, disabled people were being driven to death and suicide. You know, the NHS was being gutted. The education system that was already crumbling was having further resources withdrawn. We were being told by these politicians that it was sensible to squander hundreds of billions of pounds in nuclear weapons. You know, we were all in it together in that sense. And you know, I think that context really added to the you know, the inhumanity and the ridiculousness of how much this country spends on nuclear weapons. And I think it added another powerful argument to folk campaigning against nuclear weapons in Scotland and in Britain and across the world, really. And, you know, it goes without saying that the peace movement in Scotland, you know, has a really proud history. As Iona touched on, you know, I think the peace camp up at Fastlane captures the imagination of a lot of folk, and it certainly, you know, does so much to add to the prominence of the campaign in Scotland. But, you know, you have the history of thousands of people all across the country giving their time, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, to what's a really important issue. And, you know, a lot of folk don't realise that nuclear weapons still pose an existential threat to humanity alongside climate change. So that was probably my long-winded route into CND.
I'm fascinated to listen to both of you. It's
very impressive.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's just really, really interesting. So I was going to ask you about what support you'd like to see from, you know, the general public. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you about the particular significance of Friday the 22nd of January in terms of the international treaty. So I'm sure you'd both like to tell us a bit about that. Could I start with you this time, Johnnie, and ask you just to explain to the listeners about the treaty?
Yeah, no problem at all. Helpful that you chose me, because when speaking to Iona beforehand, we agreed to divvy it up that way, so you didn't throw a spanner in the works too early.
Feel free to pass the sort of the mic to the other person if it's more appropriate at any time. We just want to hear from both of you. So.
Yeah, no worries. So as you alluded to, the 22nd January on Friday, it's when the treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Sorry, I was so excited by it, I forgot the full name there. The Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes into force internationally. So just going a few years back, on the 7th of July 2017, it was after a decade advocacy by the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons and its partners, including Scottish CND, managed to get an overwhelming majority of the world's countries to adopt this landmark global agreement to ban nuclear weapons. That's the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW for short, which helps if you're having to say it a lot, of course. So prior to the treaty's adoption, it really does need to be remembered that nuclear weapons were one of the only weapons of mass destruction that weren't subject to this type of comprehensive ban, despite the fact that, you know, as we said, these are catastrophic weapons, widespread and persistent in terms of their humanitarian and their environmental impact. So it was the view of CND and peace campaigners around the world that the TPNW could really fill in what's a significant gap in international law. In terms of what the agreement does, it prohibits nations from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, possessing, stockpiling, using or threatening to use nuclear weapons, or allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed in their territory. And it would also prohibit them from assisting, encouraging or inducing anyone else to engage in those sorts of activities. So as you can tell, it's intended to be a very comprehensive document in that respect. So, what does that mean for a country like Scotland or Britain at present? A nation that does possess nuclear weapons can join the treaty so long as it agrees to destroy them in accordance with a legally binding and time-bound plan. At the same time, a nation that hosts another nation's nuclear weapons on its territory can also join as long as it agrees to remove them within a specified deadline. And countries that are signing up to the treaty also have an obligation, which is very important, to provide assistance to all the victims of the use and testing of nuclear weapons over the years, and to take measures to remedy contaminated environments, of which there are a great many. And you'll find as well in the document, the preamble acknowledges that harm that's been suffered as a result of nuclear weapons, including the disproportionate impact on women and girls and indigenous peoples, particularly around the world. So even though it's not been signed or ratified yet in Scotland or in Britain, we still consider it's a really powerful tool for everyone fighting for nuclear disarmament. And it shows that it's not just history that's on our side, but it's the majority of the world. So I've got a few points as well about how people can support it, but I'll just see if Iona was wanting to add anything to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That was great. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most beautiful things about this treaty, which I think you picked up on there, is the fact that it explicitly states that not only can you not use nuclear weapons, but you can't threaten their use. And whilst it kind of seems like this is just an obvious kind of afterthought, what that part of the treaty actually does is it kind of decimates the whole deterrence argument, which all of the nuclear armed states actually kind of rely on in terms of their own kind of legal infrastructure. So we, in the UK, for example, Trident, we operate under a policy known as MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, which is this kind of idea that we have early warning systems. We'll know if somebody fires a nuclear weapon at us, and we'll have time to be able to fire one back. So it's written into our kind of constitution for having nuclear weapons that we'll have, we will threaten to use them in this way. And so this kind of makes this kind of strategy completely illegal under international law for the countries that sign it, which is really important. And I think that's essentially this treaty it's come about at a time where as Johnny's kind of touched on, there wasn't really too much in terms of when you're campaigning against nuclear weapons, you're always kind of trying to look for ways that you can define them as being illegal. So they are legal under, for example, the Geneva Convention, or are they illegal under various other weapons treaties. So the most kind of solid one that we had up until this point was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the UK actually did sign in 1970. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty kind of had three pillars. So the first pillar, which is the one that kind of gets focused on, is this idea that we would not proliferate the use of nuclear weapons. So we would not increase our stockpiles. We would not increase the capability of our warheads. We would not kind of make them any more powerful than they already were. The second pillar was, in fact, disarmament. So all of the countries that signed pledged that they had a shared goal of global nuclear disarmament and that they were going to work towards this. And then the third pillar was about the peaceful use of nuclear energy and the assurance that the nuclear energy industries would be used for peaceful methods and civilian methods only, and would not be used as kind of testing grounds to develop new kind of weaponry uses. So the UK actually did sign this one back in 1970. However, the wording of the treaty is incredibly vague. It doesn't set deadlines. It doesn't really set specific quotas. And essentially, I mean, you could argue that all three pillars have been vastly ignored by all of the kind of signatory states since its inception. So in 2020, we actually had the 50th anniversary of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so it was up for, there was to be a review conference held. But sadly, that was postponed because obviously the pandemic hit. So that is due to happen also this year. It's said to happen before April this year. So I think it's actually interesting that it's going to kind of coincide within a few months of this kind of new treaty entering into force, which I think was largely designed to kind of try and address that kind of vagueness and be like, yeah, we're not messing around here. We're not having any of your vague statements. You're getting rid of them. You're getting rid of them now. So, and I think, so we've got, in terms of like how all of this affects kind of us here in Scotland, as Johnnie was saying, and here in the UK, because the UK obviously has not signed the TPNW and actually refused to even send anybody to the negotiations to even consider signing the TPNW. However, you know, it's not the end of the road for us. So there has already been, I mean, since 2017, when we kind of had the initial signing of this by 122 countries, you've already seen over 50 major leading kind of global financial institutions divest their money from the nuclear weapons industry. So the treaty is kind of being felt all over the world, even in the countries that refuse to sign it.
Can I just ask something, probably background information from you and Johnnie's point of view, but people listening may be wondering, why has there been 3 years, or maybe even nearly 4 years, between it first being taken to the UN and now something happening 4 years later? Why the delay?
So in 2017, the UN essentially held a summit for countries to come together and negotiate and work on the treaty and come together and kind of create the treaty and have it supported by the countries. So what had then happened in terms of the UN's legal process is that it will be signed, but it will not become international law until it's been ratified by at least 50 of the countries that signed it. Now, what ratifying it means is essentially that you have to then take the treaty, take everything that it means, bring that back to your country and put it through your country's legal democratic process and make sure that everything that's going on in terms of your country's kind of laws and all of that is, you know, in line with everything that the treaty said. So for a lot of countries, this was able to happen very quickly because they don't have any dealings with the nuclear industry, and they were able to ratify it quite quickly. For others, it took a little bit longer to put it through the democratic process for one reason or another. And so you've got, for some countries, it might take several years before they're able to ratify it fully. But this treaty was actually ratified faster than any other weapons ban treaty. And countries were really, really going for it. So it took us only 3 years to hit the mark of 50 countries. So we've got, out of 122 countries that signed, we're hoping we'll get 122 ratifications. But we only needed 50 to hit that mark where the UN says, right, that's it. It becomes international law. So we hit the 50th ratification back in, I think it was the end of October, middle of October, something like that. At which point, I think it's 50 days from the date of that happening. Is it 50 days or 100 days? I'm getting this wrong. It's a certain fixed number of days. I'll sit and do the maths. After that 50th ratification, that it enters into force. So what we're seeing on the 22nd of January is the entry into force date, where it then becomes solid and binding for all of the countries that have signed it. After this point, if they're then, you know, it becomes enforceable.
So that's really helpful. That's really helpful. Only now I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so it's binding, and then there's a phrase on those who have signed it. So I'm guessing that no current nuclear states will have signed it. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So does that leave? I mean, that leaves me feeling a bit okay. So business as usual. But that's presumably is it might be understandable that I'm thinking that, but presumably that's wrong, because actually this sounds like it's a massive step forward, you know, in what's a longer game, isn't it? There's going to be other things needed before we actually do manage to get rid of nuclear arms. Yeah,
absolutely, and I'm sure Iona would agree. You know, it's a longer term process that will take you know, mass movements in a number of countries, not least the nuclear armed ones. But you know, in addition to what we've said, a treaty like this is a big step in removing the legitimacy of that very small minority of countries in retaining these arms and isolating that diplomatically. And it needs to be remembered that to maintain and facilitate these weapons, they do rely on a number of nominally non-nuclear armed allies. So, increasing the number of countries that are out with that web is always a big step forward in that sense as well.
So it's optimistic for the future. So what about the idea of how, like, anybody who's listening who's not a member of CND but would want to support? I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of people that I come into contact with are definitely against nuclear weapons, but there is a lot of ignorance about it, and I don't think it's been quite as much on people's radar as it maybe used to be, like back in the day. So and it's thanks to people like yourselves that is being, that it is being more, people are being made more aware. How can people support what CND are doing without, obviously they can join, but in what other ways do you think the public can support you?
I'm happy to dive in now unless you're keen.
Yeah, on you go, Johnnie.
I've got a list, but I'll let you run.
I'm sure yours is more exhaustive than mine. So, as you said, in addition to joining Scottish CND, which of course we would encourage folk to do, but out with that, in the first instance, finding out about the arguments, because as you said, I think a lot of folk probably have quite an instinctual distrust and probably opposition to nuclear weapons, but they might not, as you say, be aware of some of the intricate arguments, because they're not given a lot of time in the monopoly controlled media, and there's some orthodoxies that are just accepted about the need to maintain mutually assured destruction, etc. So familiarising yourself with those sorts of arguments, and once you're equipped with those, having those sorts of discussions in your community, in your workplace, in your school campus, in your university campus, and trying to persuade folk the arguments against nuclear weapons, and that might seem like a small step on an individual basis, but it's those sorts of small acts brought together that form the broad movement that can achieve something like this. If you're a member of a trade union, have that discussion in your branch. If you're a member of a political party, bring those arguments to your national conference and win the arguments, hopefully.
We have done that in our SNP Kelvin branch. Jean Anderson is in our branch, and they brought a motion on the nuclear roadmap to the conference. I know that they were a bit disappointed because they felt it had been watered down a bit, but that they're persisting with that, and that I can tell you that at SNP conference, the one thing that gets massive applause is when people speak out against nuclear weapons. It's unbelievable. It's one of the most the things that seems to motivate people the most. It really does. It's quite marked when you're in the hall when anybody brings it up. It really is. Iona, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great that you mentioned the roadmap report. Again, to your listeners, go to the Scottish CND website and check out the roadmap to Trident removal report. And while you're there, some of the other reports are fantastic in terms of, as I was talking about earlier, a lot of the arguments that you hear in Scotland, it's all about, but what about the jobs and what about this and that? Without really being aware that there's lots of work being done all over the UK on issues like defence diversification and finding suitable alternatives and kind of peaceful alternatives for these technologies and for these jobs and all of these things that are going on. So yeah, really familiarise yourself with all of that stuff so that when you're having your argument at 2 a.m. down the pub, you're a bit clued up and you can actually say, well, you're wrong. Here's a report about this and that. I would say that, this.
Sorry, carry on. I beg your pardon.
But yeah, following on from what Johnnie was saying, I think in terms of, sort of really sort of pushing stuff and getting stuff out there, you can put, putting pressure on your local council to join the nuclear-free local authorities. You can put pressure on your bank or your pension fund or your university or your the company you work for to divest money from nuclear weapons and the arms trade. You can find more about that by checking out the Don't Bank on the Bomb campaign, which has got a great presence in Scotland as well. What we can also do, I mean, certainly in reference to the treaty, we're in a bit of a bizarre position in Scotland. So when the treaty was initially signed, we actually had a symbolic signing of the treaty at Holyrood, even though we weren't allowed to sign the actual thing. But the thing is, there are parts of the treaty which include things that fall under devolution, under devolved powers. So there are certain parts of it that, if it wanted to, Holyrood could begin to ratify, as I said, kind of put it through the process and make it a part of your infrastructure, even if we can't sign it. And one of those things is education. So one of the really nice parts of the treaty, it says, you know, you've got to emphasize the importance of peace education, put that into your schooling system. And we're starting to get some great infrastructure in Scotland for that. As I said, Peace Education Scotland is a great organisation. It's got lots of teaching modules on their website, all about various issues to do with nuclear weapons, not explicitly political. Everything's just educational, and they're all downloadable for free. So if you're a teacher or a parent trying to come up with creative new lesson plans during lockdown, they can be great materials to check out. And I'm just going to finish on terms of this is my last point, I promise. In terms of
it's
on the 22nd on the day, there's going to be certain things that you can do. I think we're trying to encourage people to go out and clap. I think there's going to be bell ringing in certain cities, but you can check out the activities at www.nuclearban.scot. And for those of you like myself who prefer to sit and campaign under a blanket, we're also hoping to have a Twitter storm going on, quite active on the day. So if you want to take part in that, we're using #NuclearBan is the kind of international ICANN sort of hashtag that's going to be going out. And it's going to be #NukesOutUK for the UK kind of Twitter storm.
Okay. Bearing in mind that this interview will be going out on Friday the 22nd, so people should be doing it right now.
Perfect, because I'm not allowed to reveal that information until the 22nd, so I'm banking on that.
Yeah, I'm looking at your website, and you know there's quite a lot of information there about how people can learn more about the nuclear ban and how they can find a step-by-step guide to ask their banks and their pension providers not to support nuclear weapons. And also there's links to a whole list of events and celebrations around the world that people, if they're sitting at home, they can tune into. So thanks. Marlene, what was that you wanted to ask when I stopped you? It was just because I was conscious that we were supposed to be going to Iona for her take. So can I bring you in now? Sorry about that.
Yes, actually, I think I've now forgotten what it was when that happened. But actually, there's a couple other things. I think you've kind of touched on them indirectly, Iona. But when I was reading through the emails that I get from Scottish CND, I came across something called a TPNW challenge. A sort of day-by-day challenge. I think is it this week in the run-up to Friday the 22nd that it's happening? Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, I'm happy, just because I've got it conveniently up in front of me. So as you'd mentioned, Marlene, it's day by day, and it's actually already commenced, but there's no reason that folk can't get on the bandwagon and take up some of these tasks even after the date, because you know it's all really important work and part of advancing that campaign for nuclear disarmament. So the first part of the challenge is alerting the media. So that can be writing a letter to your local paper, your parish magazine, your favourite online publication. And we've got a template online with some suggestions at banthebomb.org. The next challenge is to make some art. So that could be anything from writing a poem, making music, creating a poster to celebrate the nuclear ban to put in your window this Friday. I wouldn't challenge myself to that because I'm not all that creative, but I'm sure there's some folk out there that are more than capable. As Iona touched on already, and I think this is definitely one that can be carried forward, is to teach peace. So you can go about that by contacting your local school and ask them to include peace education in their curriculum. And there's a lot of resources for that, as Iona mentioned, at peaceeducationscotland.org. Another one that Iona touched on already was Money Talks. So that's about contacting your bank or your pension provider or any other sort of institution of that nature, and telling them about the treaty and requesting that they cease and desist from investing in nuclear weapons. And again, there's template letters for that online at nukedivestmentscotland.org. The challenge for Wednesday the 20th is to listen to survivors, and again, Scottish CND's social media is a really invaluable resource for that. There's a lot of really excellent and moving resources there, where you can hear the stories of nuclear test survivors and other testimonies. So I'd strongly encourage folk to undertake that part of the challenge. The next is to write to your representative. So contacting your politicians, as Iona mentioned, that can be anyone up from council upwards. So contact them, tell them about the TPNW, ask them to sign the ICAN pledge in support of the nuclear ban. And if they've already done so, you can just send them a nice thank you letter, of course. And there's plenty of information about that on icanw.org. And finally, as has already been touched on, this Friday, just join the celebrations. There will be, obviously, as I already mentioned, you can get out on your own doorstep, which is probably quite stirring, but there's a virtual event as well that folk can join. So you can add your voice to the celebration and the noise around the coming into force of the treaty.
Oh, fantastic. I'm just picking up on what you said about listening or watching to information from survivors, because that's where you can really kind of get into people on a very deep emotional kind of level, really, can't you? And some months back, excuse me, well, it was last year, Val and I interviewed 3 people, I think it was, at the anniversary of the 75th anniversary of Nagasaki bomb being dropped. And one of the people we talked to was Isabel Lindsay, who's a active Scottish CND member, and I was really moved at some of what she talked about. I mean, obviously not because she's a survivor, but her father was involved in Japan after those attacks happened. I mean, he was presumably there in some military connection, and she just talked about what she'd learned from him, and he'd obviously been highly affected by it, so had she. And I mean, I was listening to her, actually. It's just a really, really good way of bringing home to people what it might actually mean. And actually, the other thing that occurs to me is kind of even all those awards that the Chernobyl series got. I mean, not about a nuclear attack, but about a nuclear accident. That kind of got it home to people as well. So anyway, hopefully, loads of folk are taking up on that TPNW challenge.
Can I ask a question? Marlene mentioned nuclear accidents, and I noticed there's an article in the National today about the fact that despite the fact that we're in the middle of a full-blown pandemic, and there's also a severe weather warning coming up shortly, that there's still nuclear convoys on the road. And the weekend, a nuclear convoy passed through central and southern Scotland carrying Trident nuclear missile warheads, and it was going to the Royal Naval Armaments Depot at Coolport, which is just beside the Clyde submarine base at Faslane. Iona, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, they just won't stop, will they? I mean, we get usually over 6 convoys a year. And yeah, so they start off down at an airfield in Burfield, which is right down in kind of south of England. And they come up on the public roads, and they come right the way through Scotland. And sometimes they'll kind of sneak up kind of on the west and kind of through kind of on the M8 kind of through Glasgow, and sometimes they'll take a more kind of northern route through Stirling and kind of along west that way. But yeah, I mean, they're on public roads the entire time, and they're absolutely notorious for getting into having safety incidences and safety breaches. And it's something that's really been kind of highlighted in the campaign in the last sort of 3 years, particularly by an organization called Nuke Watch, that really there is no kind of plan in place for what happens when there is a safety breach. And that actually there's a bit of kind of back and forth between the kind of Scottish local authorities and kind of Westminster as to whose responsibility it is to actually make sure that there are risk assessments and contingency plans in place. But I mean, the convoys are, yeah, they're kind of notoriously unstable, really. I mean, there were 44 safety incidents with convoys reported for 2017 alone, which if you think about it, I mean, you have, generally speaking, 6 to 10 convoys a year. That's kind of multiple safety incidences per convoy. And it does seem to be rising. I mean, there was only, for example, 6 recorded incidences in 2009. But there's a total of 179 for the last 10 years in total. So, I mean, if you think about, 6 to 8 convoys a year, let's be generous and say, even if you had 85 convoys in that time, that's still at least 2 safety incidences per convoy, if you kind of average it out. So generally speaking, they are kind of notoriously unsafe. And so the MOD kind of, they put on these kind of mock accident exercises. Sorry, did you want to come in there?
No, I was just going to say that I remember about a year ago or so, there was an incident where they had crossed the Erskine Bridge at a time of high winds, in order to get to Faslane. And I thought that was quite a terrifying prospect, having a nuclear convoy crossing the Erskine Bridge in high winds.
Absolutely. And if you've ever seen one, I mean, I think the thing that always surprises me is that civilian cars get stuck in them accidentally. If you've ever seen one go past, you get all of the kind of the police cars and the security cars, and then you've got the big warhead carriers, and then you've got this kind of terrified looking guy in a Fiat, who's obviously just pulled into the motorway at absolutely the wrong moment, got trapped in the middle of this convoy, and now just has to go to Coalport because he can't get back out of it.
Really?
They're big. You're talking about multiple vehicles, lots of vehicles, and that are kind of, people just get stuck in them, and as they go along. The MOD kind of have various. Oh no, on you go.
No, carry on, Iona. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, beg your pardon. So the MOD have at various points over the years kind of role-played this idea of what it might be like if there were to be a more serious kind of accident with one of these convoys. And they role-play them in kind of various locations. There was one in 2011 at a naval base in Ayrshire. There was another one called Exercise Astral Climb at an old coal base in Fife, where essentially they attempt to role play what would happen if, for example, a heavy goods vehicle collided with a weapons carrier and both kind of overturned and were seeping radioactive waste, or what would happen if 2 of the carriers collided into one another, or something like this, and there was some kind of accident involving radioactive waste kind of being leaked on the roads. And every single time they do these exercises, they just get absolutely, I mean, they never release the results, which they should. Under Freedom of Information Acts, they are supposed to release the results quite instantly, and they tend to kind of hold off for a couple of years because it's to avoid embarrassment, because every single time. So I think the first one in 2011, it took 5.5 hours for anyone from the MOD to respond to this so-called accident, because it had happened up in Scotland, and there was no MOD contingency planning for the convoy accidents. And then I think the second time they realized that everybody involved would have been contaminated because the protective equipment that they were using to avoid the contamination was completely useless. And because everyone was wandering around in these useless respirators, it completely broke down any level of communication between different agencies. I think there was another issue where the police had neglected to inform their commander to even attend any of the kind of briefing meetings about it, and they always kind of result in just kind of an absolute mess where they realize, okay, this is terrible, everybody would have died.
Sounds very frightening. I tell you what, thinking about the convoys, I'll tell you what's brought to my mind is the thought of the amazing, redoubtable Brian Quayle, who's, despite the fact that he's over 80, is well known for lying down in the road in front of them. And I just wondered if you had any word of Brian, because I know he was ill and in the hospital recently. Do you have any news, or maybe you maybe don't have any news about Brian, do you? Do you know how he's keeping?
It's going to take more than a trip to the hospital to keep Brian down. Brian he's very well. Last I've seen him, we have been, the last few times I've been trying to persuade Brian not to go down to Faslane on the 22nd and fling himself in front of the gates and get himself arrested. He was very much hoping to be vaccinated in time, and we've all been going, Brian, you're not well, stay home. It's lovely energy.
He's amazing. Well,
that's amazing.
That's good news. That's brilliant news. I'm glad to hear it. So, I'm conscious of the time. It's fascinating listening to both of you. I was wondering if we could just move on to hopes for the future. You know, what are your hopes for the future realistically? I mean, this is a great step forward, the ratification of this treaty. Maybe I'll come to Johnnie and then to Iona. Johnnie, what would your main hopes for the future be for disarmament here in Scotland, but also internationally? What would you be hoping for realistically in the time to come?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we already sort of touched on, you know, it's unfortunately not a battle that will be won overnight, but at the same time, very few important battles rarely are. So, you know, I mean, I think in terms of our hopes for the future, it's important to, you know, keep building the pressure in Scotland and across the world for nuclear disarmament. I'd hope that here in Scotland that can mean that, you know, CND keeps growing and is, you know, a broad organisation taking everybody who's opposed to nuclear weapons. And I think probably in the long term our goal has to be not just seeing you know, these atrocious crimes against humanity removed from the Clyde, but from the world. So I think that you know, well, the TPNW is really exciting and stokes that hope. You know, that there's big challenges that lie ahead in terms of winning those arguments up and down the country, and then making sure politicians are held to account and enforcing them. One of the other things I think we touched on, or haven't touched on, and it's a big topic, but as well, I think, you know, we need to start having the discussion and winning the argument about NATO membership, because, you know, in Britain today that's taken as, you know, an orthodoxy. You know, you can't question membership in NATO, and you know, in terms of what the plans have been for potentially a post-independence Scotland, you know, well we've had very, very positive statements from the First Minister about nuclear weapons. At the same time, they remain committed to you know, NATO membership for independent Scotland. And we need to remember that NATO is an aggressive nuclear first strike alliance, and you know, even if you don't have the nukes in your soil, if you're complicit in that sort of thing, there's a degree of culpability there. So I think that's something that peace campaigners across Scotland and across all of the countries that are currently involved in NATO need to have in their crosshairs.
That's interesting, because I think that is an issue that has historically caused huge controversy and division in the SNP, hasn't it? You know, there have been people that were chucked out of the party, I think, and I think that I think that is an issue that has caused a lot of debate and controversy within the party, and I'm sure in the future there'll be more debate about it, Johnnie.
Yeah,
thanks
absolutely.
very much. Iona, how about yourself? How do you see the future? What are you optimistic? Does it give you hope? You know, this treaty.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. I mean, I think I was having this conversation actually with Johnnie earlier on. Is that it's slightly depressing for myself, coming from a standpoint of kind of doing a bit of anti-capitalist campaigning and kind of coming at it from that standpoint of kind of facing up to the reality that actually the way that kind of the overall kind of disarmament is likely going to be facilitated is through divestment, and it's only through these kind of engaging with the capitalist systems that we're really going to see the end to them. But I think that's probably the most major impact that the treaty is going to have in a lot of the nuclear armed states, especially straight off the bat. So it does definitely give hope to that. But I think for me also, I think just the kind of the renewed energy that's coming with the treaty, and for organizations to be looking at the ways in which ICANN is campaigning. And you start to realize, in Scotland, as I keep saying, we always just focus on what's going on at Faslane, what about the jobs? And actually what we're kind of now starting to really kind of is look at all of the intersectionalities. I mean, yes, we have to remain the peace movement, or we call it the peace movement. I think that's so fluffy. It's the anti-militarism movement or the anti-war movement. But nuclear weapons are an issue that encompasses so many things. It's an environmental issue. The use of even 2 small nuclear weapons is enough to kind of plunge us into a nuclear winter, which is essentially sort of inverse global warming. But either way, you're talking about vast famine. Potentially wiping out life on Earth. It's an independence issue. It's completely undemocratic. It's a feminist issue. The effects of radioactivity are so much more severe on the bodies of women, and yet all of the kind of judgments of their severity and all of those kind of measurements are taken against the bodies of a healthy young man. It's a human rights movement. If you want justice for the victims of nuclear testing, or justice for the victims of uranium mining, it's an anti-capitalist issue. As I've said, it encompasses so many things, and I think we're starting to kind of really wake up to that, and I think that's something that the treaty's really helped us to do. So I have a glimmer of hope, we'll see.
It's very, very moving listening to both of you, I must say. It really is. Marlene, did you have something final that you wanted to ask or say to
Well, yes, I did. But I think you've just covered it all, actually, Iona, because, I was, it is actually inspiring hearing the pair of you talk, what you say, but actually kind of how you say it as well. And I was just going to kind of say, actually, it would have to be for another time, but I was sitting here thinking, these things all link up with stuff like, environmental issues. Is nuclear power really something that should be part of, a green kind of economy? There's all that argument. Some of the other ones you mentioned that particularly kind of, I think, are intriguing is the whole thing about divestment, because there's a big divestment push to get people to get capitalists, the system to stop supporting the fossil fuel industry. But so you mentioned that one, feminism aspect, hadn't thought of that. And the one thing that kind of remains in my mind is that just picking up on, if signatories to this treaty are obliged to help a country get rid of nuclear weapons on its soil, that is presumably something that Scotland could benefit from, as and when we are independent and we've signed it. If there's any difficulties, let's say, come from Westminster or even Washington about getting rid of Trident. So I think these are all great. It'd be great to talk to you more, but I think it'll need to be a different day. But thanks so much for coming along. It's fantastic.
It's been absolutely fascinating listening to both of you. You're so knowledgeable and passionate about this subject, and it's been a real pleasure to have you on the programme today. So thank you very much, Iona and Johnnie. And I hope you'll maybe come back another time and speak to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for having us. It's been a real pleasure.
So we'll
absolutely. I've had nothing but good experiences with Indie Life.
And Iona, did you have a music request for us as well? I can't remember if I got one from you.
I did. So I requested a song. It's called Better Things by Karina Polwart. Karina Polwart, obviously very well known trad Scottish musician. She wrote a song kind of for the Scottish anti-nuclear movement. I don't know if it was for Scottish CND or for the movement. Anyway, it was released in 2008. And it's just, it's a lovely wee tune. All about why we shouldn't have Trident in Scotland.
So we're going to listen to Corinne Polwart singing Better Things, and after that we'll come back to the second half of today's daytime show, and we're going to listen to an interview that Val and I have done with Isabel Lindsay, and we'll say more about that after we've heard Better Things. Karen Polwart, here she is.